Hello and welcome to another video. So today we're taking a look at what I'm calling anti-Haven. I guess you could name it passive Haven. There's lots of different titles you could give it. It is basically a main Tenko engine, so a pretty standard Tenko engine running all your major heal cards, using a Repose engine inside of that. So using the Servant of Repose, using Apostle of Repose and Omen of Repose to your advantage as much as possible. Of course, Apostle I found to be a little clunky. I'm actually thinking of dropping it down to probably 2, honestly, considering its effects and the way it functions, and probably just upping to Purge or something to give me a better board clears. But everything else in this deck is pretty straightforward. Unicorn Knight is great because Unicorn Spear does an amazing job. Deal 4 damage, restore 1, it gives you great ways to clear things. And even Unicorn is a pretty okay body with a fanfare restore 3 to an ally's. Again, not the best, I'd much rather the spell, but that one's still okay. Otherwise, we've got pretty much everything else you could possibly need. Servant of Repose is pretty great. It can both ward up pretty well if you play it later, or you can just play it early and use it as a potential healing source. Of course, I usually play that after Tenko, so it's pretty straightforward. One of the cards I've added in so far has been Shining Bellringer. I've found that that really helps the consistency of this deck. The turn 4 can be the most awkward time, and the time when your opponent can really take over. You usually want to play Omen of Repose after Tenko as well, so you really want a 4-drop that can fill that slot. Going second, Apostle is good, but outside of that, it's really difficult to fill that 4 slot, so Shining Bellringer can be quite nice. And in the late game, you don't really lose anything by playing Shining Bellringer once you have a setup, because you're just gaining cards at that point. Godsworn, of course, is to block out any big potential threats, so there's so many now. You've got Chimera Rune, you've got Portal's Omen card set up, you've got Dragon's big threats, you've even got Sword using a heap of Storm followers, so it's really easy to block those out with Exilia and do a wonderful job. Of course, this deck is still quite legendary heavy, I guess. It's running a pretty nice 11 legendaries and mostly golds outside of that, with the only actual silver card in this deck being Unicorn Knight, because that is actually quite a good silver card. I tried to limit my 2 and 3 drops to 9 each. I didn't want to have too many 2 drops because once you get into the later game they just become clunky and useless, and same with the 3 drops, you don't really want too many of them, you want just enough that you can run your deck consistently, so that's what we were aiming for. So we're going to get right into this and check it out. So at this stage in the meta, this deck seems to be doing reasonably well. I would say it's definitely handling itself properly, although the games can be quite close and drawn out, so it's definitely for longer games and not for shorter games, just keeping that in mind. Starting hands are usually some of your more awkward points. If you know you're going second, keeping Apostle is actually quite decent if you already have Tenko, because turn 4, turn 5 is good, and Gilded Priestess is actually a good way to have a turn 2 and turn 3 play set up, because Gilded Priestess is a very easy turn 2. So you just drop it, you take either one of the amulets, depending on what you think you'll need more. Most of the time I take Draw, but sometimes Black Diamond is also quite good. And it's even nicer when you have something like Holy Priestess set up if you don't have another 3-drop that you want to play, like White Fang Temple. So it's always nice to get Princess out so then you can use Priestess. But we end up drawing the White Fang Temple anyway, and doesn't really matter. It also appears we're playing against a Mysteria deck, which both are reasonably slow as well, so we really just need to hold ourselves out until we can pretty much drop what we want onto the board. And Apostle of Repose is going to be fairly decent here. Not having to attack and get these effects works in your favor quite a bit. So being able to just pretty much remove things for free, force them to have to actually trade something into this, is always a great thing. So we get the Tenko. I do decide to attack because we don't actually have a target for its effect, so getting the damage was going to be more important, and we basically had a free turn to drop our Tenko onto the board. Now of course, as I mentioned, Mysteria decks are a little slower, which gives me a little bit of time to set up, which is where this deck can really shine. Aggro decks can be difficult, as you'll see in our next match against a mid-sword. I guess that's what we'll call it, mid-sword, but mid-sword is still pretty aggressive for a deck. It's almost on par with most aggressive aggro sword decks, especially for rotation. So it's not surprising that it was the one that kept me on my toes most of the time. And now we get a nice 6/6 dragon, and a pretty decent way to contest all this board, especially against Mysteria that can't really deal with things like this. So to go for Mysterian right, just clearing the 1/3. That's another great thing about that Unicorn card. Being a 1/3 stat line actually gives it a lot of value, as 1/3 stat lines tend to be quite good on 2 drops. So we go for Jean, Beacon of Salvation, wipes the board, gets us a couple of damage to face, while at the same time allowing us to go for 8. Our opponent unfortunately concedes before that, but we would have been pretty right from then on. And now onto the sword matchup. This matchup actually felt like it was going to go for ages, but fortunately going up against sword isn't usually the worst nightmare. As long as their early game isn't extremely solid, you can usually hold yourself pretty well, and that's why I've also added in the Shining Bell Ringers. They make a great anti-aggro tech, as they pretty much cancel out most of the aggression that opponent can do. But our opponent really isn't doing anything substantial in our opener. We started off with a really solid opening hand. Going for our globe is always great, especially when you can follow up immediately with Priestess into White Fang and so on, and just work your way through this. Of course, the only disadvantage we've really got is the fact that we don't have a Tenko, which is where Shining Bellringer can actually come in handy. So Shining Bellringer can definitely be blocked out a little bit. So we go for the Holy Priestess because that's a pretty solid one to use. And it allows us to clean out some of this board. It did feel like this was going to go for ages though, just because of the fact that we were constantly having to clear things and wait for our Tenko play, which was a bit slow.
I'll cut a way through. I'll train harder for There's more where that came from.
But we should be pretty right. When we pay Omen of Repose, it really will help our board state, just by the fact that it really can't do a lot to us when we play it. I mean, the ramping for our opponent kind of sucks a little bit, but considering it ramps us as well, in the case of Haven, as long as your health is high enough. But we're pretty stable from here on. We don't really need to worry about too much at all. So Gem Princess, pretty standard play. I mean, we still haven't got our Tenko, which is probably the only thing that slowed this match down. If we had it earlier, it really wouldn't have been a big problem. Even at this point, it's not so much a problem as it is just inconvenient. At least this white diamond will give us a couple of draws, and we'll only overdraw by 1. Which isn't a bad spot to be in. I don't mind it if the overdraw is just 1. As we do run 3 Tenkos, so the odds of losing every single one is reasonably low. Servant of Usurpation, again, not really a problem. We did lose one of the purges there, which is a little disappointing, but again, not a problem for us. We've got a pretty stacked hand, which is what I wanted this deck to do. Make sure you've always got options and outs to the board. Of course, Zeta's a little bit of a problem though, as we don't really have a good way to counter Zeta. And I didn't want to just purge it, because I know that I'm going to need purge later on for probably a bigger board. Or at least a potentially more threatening one. Plus, getting the White Fang out gives us another chance and frees up a couple of slots, meaning we're not going to overdraw next turn. But unfortunately, it means we are going to take quite a bit of damage here. Gilded Necklace gives them a little bit, and Gilded Goblet restoring defense. This is probably a purge turn, mainly because I don't really have any other option. I need to remove the 2 big threats here and potentially block the board up a little bit. And we go for the Unicorn Spear, which is pretty decent as well. It's going to help us definitely clear some things out. So Queen Hammer, white, that's okay, we'll accept it. And a Beatrix Undying blue, so that was the problem card that I was a little worried about. At least with Tenko here now, we should be fine. We're actually going to be able to wipe this pretty clean. Because we do have the heal from the Princess. And we get our nice 6/6 dragon. So from this point, it's mainly just a matter of controlling the board enough that our opponent can't just run us over. That certainly doesn't mean it's going to be easy though.
It all ends here.
There's no missing when you're this close.
So we can wipe these out pretty quickly. We don't really have an issue, especially with a second Tenko. It actually allows us to avoid having to play Servant of Repose here, and just clean these out nicely and set up a couple more draws. Like I said, this deck is designed to be draw heavy and pretty decent against decks that tend to play more onto the board. It means they are forced to use more cards to clear these 0/4s, which is always good. And I get a pretty free turn just to throw down a Godsworn. Fortunately, I did get rid of one of my Tenkos, which was a little disappointing. But at least that's why we run 2. So Mars Silent and King Arthur, luckily for us, we have a Beacon of Salvation, which is a perfect way to remove pretty much everything here. As this alone is really no problem for us. I mean, once you play Beacon, you wipe the board. That's pretty much it with this deck. Especially against something like Arthur. It's also a good place to use Purge if I had one, but Beacon is definitely a better play. I also decided to set up the extra healing just as a bonus. Even if it was going to die, I wanted it on board. And we can't take more than 4 damage at a time now, which is really good for us. It means it's going to be a lot harder for our opponent to actually wipe us out.
I shall guide you to glory.
So I make the small error here of attacking with the 1/4. I actually could have got 1 more damage there if I didn't actually attack with the 1/4, as it would have proc Tenko again. And it would have healed my face, which would have been a bit better advantage than just attacking for 1.
You are done for. Mortal or deity, I'll have the flames of war, the fame of war.
Again, Barbarossa, not really a card I'm a big fan of when it comes down. It's a little bit of a pain to have to constantly remove. And these Apostle of Reposes, unfortunately, are pretty much dead in hand at this point. This is the reason I've considered maybe dropping it down to 2 instead of 3, as I think if I put in one of another card, it might be better value than just running 3 Reposes.
Another of God's strength.
But we can pretty much wipe most of this out now, so it's not really a problem. I don't even mind leaving up the 6/1, because we're only going to take 4 damage no matter what at this point. And it looks like they're going to try and develop more of a board this time. Even using the Gilded Boots to gain Rush. See, those Gilded cards are quite nice. The loot ones do a wonderful job. So I decided to just ward up, play off this, go for whatever I can while I can. Give us a couple of decent heals and hope my pings go where I need them. And unfortunately 1 did miss. I would have liked to hit the 6/1 there, but I mean, it's still acceptable. The Chromatic Duel. Definitely not a bad play. They're going to be able to wipe all these out. We're definitely still in the lead, I think, when it comes to just purely being able to beat our opponent. Especially now they've played Despair Messenger. Returning all those cards to your hand was probably the biggest mistake my opponent could have made. Of course, they were looking for early pressure, but without realizing I've actually got a second Tenko set up, along with the fact that I am just going to pretty much wipe this out in the following turn with Unicorn, gave us a pretty much perfect lethal at this point. I mean, we get to go for a minimum of 12 damage to face, which is nuts, and worked pretty wonderfully in our favor. So this is definitely not a deck to sneeze at. It does a wonderful job both controlling the board and pinging off damage and keeping yourself alive. It's what I love about these sort of decks. Even if Tenko wasn't such a big card, I would still like to run decks like this that stop your opponent from being able to kill you effectively, and having to constantly deal with something on the board is always what I like about Haven decks. I've always liked the more control-y archetype ones over anything else, and we'll probably continue to play this right through this meta, as there's no reason not to at this point. Most of these cards will be in rotation for a little while, and that'll be a lot of fun. So if you guys did enjoy this video, hit the like button and subscribe, and until next time, see ya.